My name's Sam Husseini. I'm an independent journalist. I've been covering this and related issues for several decades. The last month or so, I've stepped up my questioning at the State Department, attempting to address some of the issues that we're going to deal with today. I write at Substack because, as the last panel amply talked about, major media in the United States is difficult to expect a great deal of actual information from at Husseini.org. You can get to that and my other work in other ways. I'm going to just make some overall comments, questions that I have in general, and then actual lawyers who actually know the specifics of things will chime in. Big question for me is legal remedy. Is it a remedy? Or are laws like cobwebs, as it's been said, able to constrain the weak but not the strong? Will we get accountability that way? Could it be done through US laws, Israeli laws? Could it be done through the International Criminal Court, the ICC, or is that, as many have argued, a captured institution? You have country after country now attempting to invoke the ICC, but it's basically in the hands of one man, Khan, a British barrister, to whether or not to move on it. And so far, attack after attack on Gaza, the ICC has not done anything. Is another path possible, the Genocide Convention? Any country could invoke the Genocide Convention at a different venue, the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court. That is what Francis Boyle did for the Bosnians when they were under attack by Yugoslavia. But you need a country to invoke it. And so far, to my astonishment, sort of, no country has invoked it. Even countries that have called it genocide, Brazil, South Africa has indicated as such, Pakistan, countries that have severed relationships with Israel, Bolivia, and so on, none have stepped forward to invoke the Genocide Convention. This may well be because Abbas and company have asked them not to. I think this is a serious matter for independent media to inquire. I have seen very little, again, stepping from the prior panel about the role of media. We should also scrutinize media that's been critical of Israel. Democracy Now! And Al Jazeera have been critical of Israel, but they have not laid out what the legal remedies are, even when they call it genocide. What's the legal remedy for it? I think that's desperately needed. We also see at the State Department, US and Israel seeming to eviscerate the Geneva Conventions. One of the questioners from the last panel talked about the nuclear threat. I think that's a very serious thing here. Obviously, it's not practical for Israel to nuke Gaza. They've already obliterated it in other ways, but the region, Israel's nuclear weapons arsenal, which is not acknowledged by the United States and I think is too rarely analyzed in terms of the role it's played here, the US moving carriers into the region, and the at least implied, if not outright, nuclear threats that are likely being issued, and the illegality of that, I think, is also a factor that merits scrutiny. One of the wonderful panelists from the last session said that Israel is engaging in revenge. I beg to differ. I don't think that this is revenge. Revenge would be understandable. I think that this is, nor is it unplanned, as has been suggested. I think this is a very well-planned, methodical program of ethnic cleansing in order to pursue a long-term goal. October 7th is the pretext for this long-planned scheme, which fits into a much longer range framework. First up, Sarah, delighted to have you on. I know she is the executive director of Dawn and has worked for years as well with Human Rights Watch and has done, among other work, some excellent recent analysis regarding ethnic cleansing and the Biden administration's facilitation thereof. Delighted to hear your analysis.
Thanks, everyone, and good to see so many friends and colleagues here today. The topic of our panel is international humanitarian law as it applies and as it can be upheld in Gaza, but it really is a bit surreal to be having this discussion at a moment when we are seeing what appears to be a genocide in Gaza supported by the United States. I think many of you probably share my own feelings of not just outrage, but despair for what appears to be the absolute failure of international humanitarian law and the laws of war to do anything to protect the people in Gaza. And I think what makes it so painful for people here in the United States like myself, what elevates this to something that causes us so much shame on top of the pity and horror that we feel is that our government is directly complicit, directly funding, underwriting, supporting, protecting, and shielding Israeli actions in Gaza. And so it implicates all of us as Americans. Nevertheless, since I've been asked, I will take a few moments to outline briefly some of the sort of top-level international law crimes, crimes that violate international humanitarian law provisions in the Geneva Conventions, in the Rome Statute, in various other treaties and conventions that pertain to armed conflict during a time of war. And I'll touch on some of what are considered the more controversial aspects or debated aspects that are emerging right now, which I think may be useful to you. There are a lot of crimes that there are defenses to or attempted defenses to that we are seeing regularly playing out, such as the current attack on Shifa Hospital and whether or not it's being used for military purposes. But first and foremost, there are crimes that are black letter violations of international humanitarian law. And it doesn't really take more than their application. You don't really need to know much more to know that an international crime is being committed. And this starts with the massive expansion of the siege and blockade of Gaza, which violates the most basic provisions of international humanitarian law, not to deprive the civilian population of items essential to their survival. And so Israel's deliberate, intentional plan executed agenda of depriving the people of Gaza from electricity, from water, from fuel, from medicine, from food, with the deliberate intent of punishing them, as numerous Israeli government statements have made clear and that were cited in the earlier panel. Those are war crimes. That application of a siege is a war crime. And so if Israel did nothing else but impose that siege, there should be enough and would be enough to prosecute them in an international criminal court. The other pretty apparent, not very debatable series of crimes that we're seeing are the indiscriminate attacks, the indiscriminate bombardment of Gaza. There is no way that I think anybody can really be compelled to believe that over the 10,000 airstrikes and bombardment that Israel has carried out in the last 40 days, that those have been deliberately and intentionally, knowingly, intelligently targeting military objects and facilities. Again, even a surface if they had all this intelligence about Hamas military targets and bases, I assure you they would have sought them out and bombed them for the years preceding, when they regularly conduct airstrikes against alleged Hamas militants and so forth. And so I think it would be fairly easy, and the evidence we see, that the airstrikes are in fact indiscriminate, that they are hitting a wide area, that they are demolishing residential apartment buildings where thousands of people reside, that they're bombarding in such a wide and diffuse manner throughout all of northern Gaza and southern Gaza, that these strikes appear to be indiscriminate on their face. What gets a lot less attention, and I think is perhaps very upsetting for people who are pro-Israel to hear, is the overwhelming evidence of deliberate attacks on civilians. And when I explain to people that deliberate attacks on civilians is a policy of the Israeli government, it's nothing new. It didn't start on October 9. It has been a long-standing policy of Israel since I've been documenting Israeli war crimes going back an embarrassing and painful number of decades. And that is because Israel refuses to recognize the international law requirement of who is and isn't subject to lawful attack. The law is very clear. Civilians are not subject to attack, and combatants or people who are actively participating in hostilities, so someone who is not a fighter but who picks up a gun and participates in hostilities, they are subject to attack. Israel says, no, 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 no. We don't care about what international law has to say. We are going to come up with our own definition of who we can target. And that definition is a magic definition that exists only in our heads, and that is the label terrorist. There's no label of terrorist in international humanitarian law. And certainly not a label that says that terrorists are legitimate objects of attack. But it is by using this categorization of terrorist that Israel avoids international law requirements to target only combatants by defining all of Hamas, including its civilian wings, including its civilian bodies, its justice ministry, its education ministry, as terrorists. It therefore says we are targeting them and destroying them because they are terrorists. And frankly, they don't care about what international law does, but under international law, targeting civilian objects does not become okay, remains a grave breach of international law, regardless of whether or not Israel believes them to be terrorists. So in Hamas's mind, they've gone a little bit beyond in this war, saying that they are also deeming terrorists photojournalists. Israel is deeming photojournalists as terrorists, and therefore openly, without apology, without regret, targeting journalists, as the photojournalist who was assassinated 2 days ago in his home with his family in Gaza would attest, but also at least one journalist has been assassinated by Israel in Lebanon. On, again, claims that he is either a Hamas member or Hamas supporter. And we've seen that definition expand such that medical workers are subject to attack because they support Hamas, that ambulance drivers are subject to attack because they support Hamas. But in all of these ways, in fact, what Israel is doing is perhaps one of the gravest, if not the gravest, crimes of international law, deliberately and intentionally targeting civilians. The more difficult case of international law is disproportionate attacks. If there is a military target, but there are civilians present there, what does the law allow? And I think that the ongoing debate about Shifa Hospital is an example for that. Where you have an object, a hospital that's immune from attack, but you have claims, and it's always claims, that there are militants present. And when can an armed party to a conflict strike this? And the rule is proportionality, and proportionality is the worst rule in international law because basically it allows a party to the conflict to weigh the military advantage of carrying out a strike versus the potential harm. But I think on its face, a number of the Israeli strikes, even if you believe the claim that there are militants located there or weapons there and so forth, the number of casualties appears to be vastly disproportionate to a strike that the U.S. military would deem acceptable and justifiable. We have had strikes where 500 people have been killed, with Israel subsequently alleging that some Hamas fighters were there. And one of the rules of proportionality, or one of the criteria of proportionality that gets lost, but I want you all to think about in the case of Shifa Hospital, is in making that proportionality determination about whether or not it's legitimate to go after a military target in a civilian place. The criteria is not merely the presence of weapons there, is not merely the presence of what we've seen of Hamas uniforms found supposedly at Shifa Hospital, but whether they are actively endangering the enemy. So, for example, if all the fighters were dead and all you had were some guns, that would not justify striking the hospital. That would not be an appropriate determination of proportionality. Instead, the proportionality that Israel has put in its mind is that we want to destroy Hamas anywhere or anything associated with Hamas, civilian or military. We can target under the principles of proportionality because our military objective is worth everything else, including the loss of every Palestinian life. That is rendering the concept of proportionality really devoid of any meaning, and I think would be rejected by every military who has sort of written standards on these calculations. Human shielding in urban warfare is another one of those aspects of international law that's regularly thrown around. And again, sadly, one that I've been dealing with for many, many years. And I think it's important for people to understand, particularly as you engage in discussions and debates about these issues, is that international law does not ban urban warfare. Urban warfare is often unavoidable, just as Ukrainian forces are in some cases defending their cities from civilian areas, from nearby, from within civilian areas, because it may be unavoidable. So too, armed groups or militaries like Israel's will base themselves in civilian areas because they might find it unavoidable. The only rule for parties to a conflict is to avoid endangering civilians by putting their men and equipment in a civilian area to the extent feasible. So if Hamas has nowhere else to fight from, that's obviously a question to be examined, then merely being present in civilian areas is not a crime, nor should we treat it as a crime, nor should we say, therefore, everything there is subject to attack, any more than we would say that everywhere a military camp or a soldier appears in Israel is therefore subject to military attack, or that that is violating the laws of war merely because of their presence. Because note, Israel is in a state of war and is subject to the laws of war at all times for its own conduct. The act of shielding, the crime of shielding, is deliberately using a civilian to shield yourself from attack. Deliberately grabbing a body with the intent that you're going to use this person to defend yourself from attack. And I think it might be interesting for some people to know that in the years that we previously at Human Rights Watch, but also at Amnesty, have been documenting this, really the only cases we found of actual human shielding is by Israeli forces, typically using Palestinian children to shield themselves from attack. Some recent images have appeared of Israeli forces, again, using, I believe, some elderly Palestinians to shield themselves from attack, both in the West Bank and in Gaza. So, you know, these words get thrown around devoid of meaning, and I think ends up putting people on the defensive. You shouldn't be on the defensive when you have a better understanding of the law. I want to skip over the disinformation that has been such a prominent aspect of this war because I think another panel touched on it. But one important point that, again, a number of panelists mentioned, but I think we should all be paying closer attention to, is the crime of genocide. I am personally one of those people, as an Armenian, as a survivor of genocide, as a family as someone from a family who's experienced genocide. I'm very careful not to throw that word around lightly, and have been very careful. Actually, I don't know that there's another conflict in the Middle East in which I've thought about using that term, but the events in Gaza have risen to such a level that I think over 50, I don't know the precise number, of genocide scholars have issued very, very strong statements saying in their professional scholarly expertise the crime of genocide is underway. The Center for Constitutional Rights has put out a major report documenting, analyzing why they believe genocide is underway. And I believe, in fact, South Africa did today, if Rod's last text to me is correct, call for the ICC to investigate the crime of genocide. To do that. So I think this is a question ripe for examination and analysis. Dawn, I, and my colleagues have reached out to numerous genocide scholars, and we are in the process of assembling an event the early December when the International Criminal Court will be in New York presenting their work for the year, to at the same time examine these evidence of genocide and ongoing genocide. And I hope those who are able to will join us for that. You know, what's, the last point I would make is parallel to international laws, domestic laws in the United States that are meant to prohibit the transfer of weapons to governments that systematically violate human rights. There are now a number of policy requirements in the US Department of Defense and the US State Department that require the State Department and the Department of Defense to monitor the use of weapons by people they give weapons to, like Israel, but they don't, and they're not. To examine the civilian harm caused by US weapons used by Israel, they're not. And of course, to suspend the transfer of weapons when they're found to be used systematically to commit abuses, and they're not. You know, everything that's happening today in Gaza, from my perspective, had its debut in terms of this kind of fighting in 2008 and 9, in 2012, in 2017, in 2019, in 2021, as well as Lebanon. The civilian shielding claims, targeting people as terrorists or terrorist supporters, using banned weapons in civilian areas like white phosphorus and cluster munitions, except it's much worse. Except all of it is much worse now in Gaza than it was in those prior wars, which is just the last 2 decades, and Israel is flouting the laws of war much more openly and nakedly than it ever has before. I can tell you, we searched for statements of intent in the 2008 and 2009 war. There were very few of the kinds of statements that you're seeing Israeli officials make every day. And I think that's for 2 reasons. One is that the Israeli government is much more extremist and fanatic, and so doesn't think to censor itself, but also because the level of impunity is so high, given that whether it's a Republican administration or a Democratic administration, there's really no difference, and the US can be relied on to protect Israel from any consequences for its conduct. What's different, I think, of course, in addition to the scale of the disaster that we're seeing now in Gaza, and it's not over, the shocking numbers of killed, the broad destruction of northern Gaza, which I think is deliberately intended to make it inhabitable. Of course, now we have this International Criminal Court investigation that has formally been open since 2019. I think this presents a very important opportunity to try to use a mechanism that's not completely in the control of the United States to hold Israel to account. That is an effort that Dawn has been working very, very hard on, and continually for the past several years, submitting the names of Israeli officials who are actually complicit and involved with crimes against Palestinians, something that submissions to the ICC have been lacking to date, which therefore gives the ICC an excuse not to prosecute. Oh, well, it happened, but we don't know who did it. Well, here we're telling you who did it. I do believe that if the ICC fails to prosecute this case against Israeli and Palestinian officials for war crimes and violations of the Rome Statute, it will be the death of the ICC. And what I think we are seeing is that the ICC is already on a very fine tipping point with particularly African states who have withdrawn from the court or threatened to withdraw from the court because they only ever see it prosecute people of color, particularly Black Africans. And while the war in Ukraine and the prosecution of Putin might have given a respite to the color issue of the prosecutions of the ICC, I think it's very clear to the entire world that if Israel is not prosecuted for these crimes that it's committing right now, the ICC will be finished. Its credibility will be finished. Of course, what's pretty disturbing about this and what we've seen, and if we have more time we'll discuss, I don't want to take up all the time, is the extent to which the US government in particular has been willing and is willing to burn down the International Criminal Court, burn down the Geneva Conventions, as Sam's repeated questioning of Biden officials made clear, burn down freedom of speech in the United States, burn down freedom of association in the United States in order to shield Israel. And now Biden will even risk his re-election rather than say a word critical about Israel. This is a really shocking thing to watch, the extent of it, the extreme of it, the width of the repression that's being exercised now against Americans purely to shield Israel from criticism is something that I have never seen before, and I'm sure it's commensurate with the mass popular sentiment, which has shifted quite strongly in support of Israel, particularly among the youth, which was analyzed in the prior panel, so I won't do it. But one thing that really, really worries me is that with the expansion of public sentiment in support of Palestinian rights is an expansion of repression, not only by our government officials, not only by our police officials, many of them have been trained over the years by Israel, but also by the public sector, the corporate sector, which is exercising unprecedented sanctions and punishment against Americans for expressing their political views, as minor as liking a tweet for a ceasefire. And we know from a number of sources that there are blacklists that have been created by groups in the media, by groups in finance, by groups in real estate, by a variety of other groups to sanction and punish students, young employees, other employees, potential business partners in the field, not to do business with them, to exclude them and cancel them and punish them in a way that personally hurts them. And I think this exercise of corporate power or private sector power as a tool of repression, I don't think we've seen it emerge this way since the McCarthy era. But I assure you that nothing that happened in the McCarthy era in terms of this private sector blacklisting equals what we're seeing now. And that is a very scary proposition. So what I tell people is even if you don't care about Israel-Palestine at all, what you should care about is the extent to which your own freedoms, your own rights to protest about climate and tobacco and guns and variety of other issues, those guys are copying the Israeli playbook. And just like those guys in the defense industry and the fossil fuel industry have copied anti-BDS laws to pass laws that will sanction and punish Americans who advocate for a boycott of guns or advocate for a boycott of fossil fuels, they will follow this same Israel playbook to block and punish Americans for opening their mouths on a host of other issues. And I hope that is some way that we can think of for building broader alliances. I have a feeling my time is up, but I will just say in closing, and I'll cut out the argument that was meant to support the argument I'm going to now conclude with, which is one of the most personally troubling things for me in watching this war, and I think something that all of us activists, all of us lawyers, all of us journalists have to grapple with is the total failure of the human rights movement to achieve one positive goal, one positive outcome for Palestinian people in the face of now what we see of decades of repression. And I know that my friends and associates and colleagues in the human rights industry will say, well, we're powerless, it's not up to us, and so forth. But if you have 30, 40 years of human rights organizations documenting the evidence of what's happening and seeing no results, then I think it's time for us to reconsider our methodology and our approach for the simple reason that it's not working, and therefore we have to try something new. I'll save talking about some of the new things we're trying, so I don't hog up all the time and allow our fellow panelists to join the conversation.
Feisty gentleman. So if you're on the verge, in the extremely unlikely event that you're on the verge of falling asleep, you shan't be right now. Bruce.
Well, thank you. An abbreviated introduction. It reminds me of a comment that Samuel Johnson made about Paradise Lost, John Milton's masterpiece. It leapt forward on every page with brilliant metaphors, but none ever wished it were longer. One, I salute everyone here today, and especially Khaled, for standing up for justice. That's why we exist. Probably get surveilled, the NSA, you know. We are part of the NSA's category of the not yet guilty, which means we are really dangerous. So this is a very important event because justice and progress is made only by people who are willing to withstand popular opinion and hysteria, which is what we confront today. In some sense, we all here in this room have won lottery tickets. We're not like in Gaza City trying to dodge bullets. And if we win a lottery ticket, then we have an obligation to speak out, to utilize our freedom, to advance the cause of justice, to do whatever we can, even if it looks desperate. You've got to try. I was born in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and my first hero was William Lloyd Garrison. He was the one who started Liberator magazine in 1833, said, "Slavery is a covenant with hell," and he was driven out, tarred and feathered. He stuck it out, and he was there when the Anti-Slavery Amendment was ratified in 1865. You have to try, no matter how bleak it looks, and it certainly looks bleak in Gaza. I want to be earthbound about what is likely to happen. More than 2 millennia ago, Thucydides observed in the Peloponnesian War, international relations is the law. The strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Now, despite all the volumes, tomes created to establish international law, it really hasn't departed from that at all. In the United States, we ourselves should be shameful and are hardly an example for Israel. Covered up for decades after Hiroshima and Nagasaki with classified information, it's now understood, including by Dwight D. Eisenhower, General, and Admiral Leahy, who told Mr. Truman the bombs didn't save a single American life. We dropped them with no military objective but to send a message to Russia, stay out of Manchuria and comply with Yalta. 200,000 civilian lives killed. They didn't choose a military target. And little babies incinerated. You read John Hersey's Hiroshima. You get a good description. Now, we did have an International War Crimes Tribunal after Japan surrendered in Tokyo Bay, but it didn't include any Americans. Talk about proportionality. Nuclear bombs for a diplomatic, non-military objective. Civilian populations. Still heroized. The propaganda is so profound that still today, I would wager 99.9% of the American people think the bombs saved 2 million American lives. That's not only the first time that what we call international law looks like it's distorted because of power. You know, at the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal, which is the gold standard, the Nazis were accused of the massacre of 20,000 Polish officers perpetrated by the Soviet Union, which sat in judgment on the Nazis. But they had power, the Soviet Union did. We wanted to get our civilian, our prisoner detainees back, so that prosecution went forward. Now let's jump forward now to the situation in Gaza. What are the war crimes that are ongoing? Even to a layperson, you should understand what the crime of genocide means as applied to those horrors. It's very simple language. In Article 2 of the Genocide Convention, which was ratified in 1951. We're signatories, Israel's signatories. In fact, the Genocide Convention was born of the Holocaust. It provides, in substance, that genocide includes conspiracy or attempt or actual creating conditions of life calculated to destroy a particular group in whole or in part. Right? That's the standard. Creating conditions of life calculated physically destroy people in whole or in part. Now, what is the evidence of the intent? The Israeli entire cabinet, the defense minister says, no food, no water, no power, no electricity, no anything. The siege is on everything. And there have been various formulations of that. And it wasn't stated in a moment of passion. He's not been recanting anything. It's been echoed, embellished upon by other cabinet ministers and Prime Minister Netanyahu himself. Is there any room for debate? The purpose of the clashes, the bombings, the boycotting of any entry of anything into Gaza is to try to destroy them in whole or in part. I don't know anybody who can survive if you have no food or water. You don't need to be a lawyer to understand that. So we see an ongoing crime of genocide. Now remember, however, the Genocide Convention not only prohibits attempts or conspiracies, as well as actual genocide, but it obligates signatories to seek to prevent genocide. We are a signatory. What is the United States doing? We are becoming complicit in it, not trying to stop it, using our leverage, and we do have a substantial amount of leverage, at a minimum $4 or $5 billion every year. We have authority to impose embargoes. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act enables us to do virtually anything the president wants to try to strangle a country that we think we want to economically harm because they're not doing our bidding. Are we using that statute against Israel? Not so. Nothing like that. We tell them we've got your back. You can do anything you want. Then on the side we say, but we really like you to comply with the rules of law. But, we really don't mean it. We wink, I mean, it really is amazing. You can say these two opposite things in the same conversation. Say, at the side, it reminds me of a comment of F. Scott Fitzgerald in one of his novels. He said, in Washington, D.C., the earmark of a first rate of intelligence is the ability to keep two opposite ideas in the mind at the same time and yet retain the ability to function. That's the State Department, the Defense Department. Oh, we got your back. Do whatever you want. Whatever you need, we're in favor of. But yeah, can't you just please reduce the killing a little bit? We now have escalated. Under international law, a country becomes a co-belligerent with another country by systematic military support of its military advances. Co-belligerency or belligerency requires a declaration of war by Congress. Under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the United States Constitution. It's kind of a clause that's fallen and desuetoed. It got airbrushed out of the Constitution, even though it was the most important provision. Drafted and celebrated by James Madison, among others, because it would keep us out of war since presidents aggrandize power in war and they go to war over a straw in order to write the annals of history and create opportunities for appointments and power and jingoism. Congress certainly hasn't declared co-belligerency, but we now are engaged in belligerency, feeding intelligence, real-time intelligence to the Israeli IDF, so it assists their targeting and destruction of everything imaginable in Gaza. So what's Congress? Is Congress AWOL? Abdicate its authority? It doesn't. Saying, Mr. Biden, if you're making us a belligerent, we have to have a declaration of war. They haven't declared war since Pearl Harbor, and that's only in response to an actual attack. So despite all the criticism of Biden, where's Congress? Congress should be impeaching him. High crime and misdemeanor. You're running a presidential war without any declaration. Indeed, Congress doing the opposite. A few days before they voted the $14.3 billion additional military aid to Israel, they passed a resolution about Iran, saying the president, let's borrow from the great Gulf of Tonkin resolution. You can do anything in Iran, including attack it, destroy it, to prevent it from getting a nuclear weapon. All means necessary. Yeah, it worked out real well, the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, right? So might as well borrow it again. Our Congress is like they called the French Bourbons before the Revolution. Learn nothing, forget nothing. But Congress can shut this down. But they're all clapping. AIPAC comes in. Everyone salutes. Handfuls stand up, Thomas Massey being one and Tlaib being another. But they're kind of ostracized, you know. No way. They're going to be targeted already. I know Congressman Massey said they're already running huge advertisements against them in Cincinnati Enquirer and other places. So we're looking at the United States, and the reason why it should we should be focused on that, because we're citizens. Our government's supposed to act for us. Now, the complicity is not as direct, you know, if we're actually on the battlefield or making the munitions to send there. But as citizens, we have an obligation to say, no, we're not part of this. We don't support this genocide. We can't be silent. It doesn't matter whether we're likely to succeed. It's not acceptable in a democracy. Now, we talk about, well, free speech. Yeah, you do risk blowback in this country for free speech. It's not just this issue with Israel and Palestine. I can guarantee you. You want to fight the military-industrial complex and complain about the bloated weapons manufacturers and the stupid wars? You get fired, you get blackballed. There's no way you could go into the $2 trillion military-industrial complex industry. I had a friend once, he was assistant secretary for procurement at the Defense Department. I won't name him. And he was working he'd left the government. He was working in the private sector at that time from Northrop Grumman. And he participated as a writer, columnist, and he wrote an article he was a consultant with Northrop Grumman, and he wrote an article very critical of some of the weapons procurement of the Navy Department. He said, Bruce, I got a call the next day from the president, says you're fired. You can't do that. We got contracts with the Defense Department. You can't say anything like that. So the censorship, unfortunately, is not just limited to this particular issue. Because, I say, we have surrendered a republic and become an empire. An empire is not sympathetic to freedom of speech. We're the new chosen people, and you can't criticize the chosen people. Not if you want to take no risks. But we still have the opportunity today. I say, we have lottery tickets. We have freedom right here that we're speaking. And we have to utilize it the best we can. Whether there's blowback and we suffer or not. There's one standard that governs every citizen in a democratic dispensation. If it's the right thing to do, do it. No further questions. Just add a couple of other elements, I think, that are, because I do believe that it's wrong-headed to focus only on Biden genocide. What about Congress? Biden's not doing this without the money voted by Congress and sitting there, idle, assisting it, standing up and cheerleading everything that he's doing. Be focused on Congress, where I'm not voting for you next time. Where is your exercise of that authority? At least you should have the courage to declare war if you want to get involved in belligerency against Israel, instead of running away like a watchdog that retreats to its kennel when danger appears. That's not what we want in the Congress. Because we're not going to stop this unless we create Congress again as a true oversight body that will discharge its responsibilities. The president's going to go to war all the time no matter what, because they gain authority and power. Congress is a little bit different, except they've now become exceptionally cowardly. Now, there's always been this grain over the last 100 years. We've moved incrementally from a republic to an empire. So it's kind of slow. Now we're reaching new heights. I do agree with my partner had said, everything Biden is doing is all pushed and calculated to 2024. It may be a miscalculation. He may be losing votes, but that's the only thing that his intellect can entertain. Acquiring and staying in power. Nothing else matters. He's a sociopath. These people are. All they care about is power. And I know it sounds harsh, sociopath, but that's true. I go up there every day, Congress meeting with these people. I say, who are you? Have you ever read a book? Read philosophy? Why do you exist? Well, I'm on a team, we got to stay in power. I said, really? Did you get out of diapers or something? It sounds like I'm talking to people in a sandbox, throwing mud this way or that way. And it's a tragedy as people are dying out there. I wake up every day and say, I'm so lucky, I wake up, at least for the time being anyway, don't think I'm going to be shot at. What do we have to do? At least for ourselves. Exercise whatever powers, authority, resources, mindset we have to try to bring the United States back into accord with the rule of law. The rule of law is king. The king is not law in the United States. That was the voice of Thomas Paine of the American Revolution. That is what we virtually have lost and what we need to regain. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Bruce. Again, one of the issues that I didn't raise at the top, but very pertinent, the role of Congress and of war powers. I'm reminded with the U.S. aircraft carrier there, and some reports, somebody confirmed this to me, of U.S. troops in Israel or in Gaza, of the U.S. Marine barracks in 1982, where Congress entered into a deal with the Reagan administration that allowed the Marines there as an exception to the war powers resolution, and disaster ensued. So is the aircraft carrier a threat, or is it a target? That could be part of what we see going forward. Our next speaker is one of the few people that I don't know of here, so I will just simply read her bio. Emily Schaeffer Omer-Man is a human rights litigator with over 15 years in her practice, challenging policies and practices of the Israeli occupation in Israeli and foreign courts while representing human rights defenders denied access in Israel and Palestine. She's currently a lecturer and specialist in international humanitarian law, international criminal law, and international human rights law at American University. Please welcome Emily. Thank you.
Thank you. I was eager to get up and speak, and I know that we are nearing the end of today's program, so I will do my very best to be brief and move us into questions and answers. I want to first of all, though, thank the National Interest Foundation and Dawn for inviting me to speak to you all today. I have to say that I am extremely passionate about international law, and yet I find it extremely enigmatic. And I have never been so disappointed by it than I am right now and over the last 40 days. I am going to resist the urge to respond to many, I think, really interesting threads that my fellow panelists brought up, and hopefully we'll get to in the Q&A, in order to highlight something a little bit different, which I think is a potential hurdle when it comes to holding Israeli actors accountable for crimes against Palestinians in Gaza and also in the West Bank. I think it had maybe been mentioned in the previous panel, but I want to again highlight that under cover of war and fog of war, we're also seeing increased harassment, persecution, and violence against Palestinians in the West Bank. And so the attacks are really happening on all fronts. One of the major hurdles to holding Israeli actors accountable criminally, whether it be in the International Criminal Court or through a mechanism that I don't believe was mentioned yet today, which is universal jurisdiction. The idea that through all of the different treaties and customary law that we have, that third states have an obligation to stop other states from committing crimes and grave breaches of international humanitarian law, even when they are not parties to those crimes, even when they have nothing to do with them. And one way to do that is to exercise jurisdiction over nationals that would not otherwise come under their jurisdiction. And we call this universal jurisdiction. There are different positions that each country around the world takes on whether or not to do that. But that is an option, particularly if the ICC is failing. We will then have to look to national courts to step up and start holding actors accountable in conflicts that they are not party to, in order to preserve peace and save lives around the world. In order to do this, in any of these circumstances, a principle that is called the principle of complementarity is going to be the biggest hurdle. And right now, this is Israel's biggest shield against accountability of its own actors. And it has quite deliberately set the stage for using that as a way to block holding its own both political officials and military officials accountable. So I want to explain what I mean by this, because I do believe that if we get to a stage where it is possible to start calling on either national courts or Karim Khan, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, to go ahead with prosecutions, we're going to be faced with this particular barrier, and we're all going to have to make sure that the information is out there and that there is pressure placed in the right place. So I'm going to take us back a little bit and give you the background, but I am going to take you on a little bit of a dive into the decade and a half in which I represented hundreds of Palestinian complainants, victims, and families of victims in the Israeli military and civilian justice system. Following Operation Cast Lead, as you are all probably aware, about a year later, in September of 2009, the Goldstone Report was released. And the Goldstone Report was again, kind of ex post facto analysis of Israel's operations in Gaza during Cast Lead, but it also raised the question of whether Israel's internal investigation system was capable of adequately investigating alleged violations of the laws of war. And that started a movement on Israel's part to have an answer. Goldstone was a watershed moment for Israel, right? Because it was one of the most extreme critiques, not only of the Israeli army, but also of its own internal accountability mechanisms. And so when a year later, there was the Israeli attack on the Gaza flotilla on the Mavi Marmara, and even a request a complaint to the International Criminal Court to investigate, which did not yield any results, the Israeli government commissioned the Turkle Commission to start an inquiry into not only the flotilla event, but also Israel's internal investigation mechanisms. And Israel brought external experts and its own internal experts. NGOs were invited to participate. I participated. And some of the top level critiques of the system were, number one, impartiality. That the Israeli military justice system and civilian justice system, I'll keep it simple, but just to say that they each have different jurisdiction over different actors in military operations. That in particular, there was not adequate separation between those making the decisions about not only what are the military orders in general, what are the rules of engagement in general, but what is the individual order in that moment. So when Sarah Lee was speaking about looking at an examination of the principle of distinguishing between civilian and military targets, and then looking to see when a proportionality analysis is done, whether or not the military objective, the military advantage that is sought, and by the way, this is always an ex ante analysis, right? And even afterwards, when we go back, we judge it based on what the army was trying to achieve, not what the results were. So in this ex ante analysis, where proportionality, we're looking at whether the military advantage to be achieved is proportionate to the civilian casualties that are anticipated. And on top of that, if there are multiple means of achieving that same objective, customary international law requires that the least harmful means be the one chosen. So if the same objective can be achieved and 500 civilian casualties are expected versus another strategy wherein 200 casualties would occur, the one with 200 casualties needs to be the one that is that goes forward, and even if that is a slightly less convenient or more difficult means of carrying out the operation. The person and the body that is within the Israeli army, the military advocate general, who has a team of lawyers and military experts doing this cold calculation about who and how many and where and who's going to die and what are we going to achieve, and is the same person who then decides later whether or not an investigation should be opened into the legality of that military order. That is a massive violation of the principle of impartiality. So that was one of the key critiques of the system. Second was independence, another major requirement for an adequate investigation of violations of laws of war. The fact that the decisions being made, that the investigations are within the chain of command, is an independence problem. The other most major critique was promptness. I myself have watched families who lost unarmed family members in peaceful protests who were killed by the IDF wait for years for an answer about what would happen. Most often the answer is nothing. The case was closed for lack of evidence, or the case was closed because the soldier subjectively believed that his life was in danger. But in the interim, it took a year and a half to visit the scene of the crime. Right? So there are inadequacies in this system on all levels. And I can tell you that from reading hundreds of closed investigation files after the fact. But I can also tell it to you from the statistics. And I think some staggering statistics are helpful here. And I want to, looking for a nonviolent word to say, to arm you with them. I want to hand them over to you. So first of all, between 2017 and 2021, The Israeli military received 1,260 complaints of offenses by Israeli soldiers against Palestinians. I don't have to tell you that that is a fraction of the offenses that probably occurred. There are numerous reasons why Palestinians would not want to engage with the Israeli military justice system. And one of those reasons is also because of the results, because of the lack of results. It feels like a futile exercise. Of those 1,260 complaints, criminal investigations were only opened in 21% of them. And only 11 indictments were served. 11 indictments out of 1,260 complaints. According to my research, I'll give you another figure. According to my research, less than 15 soldiers have been prosecuted for the killing of Palestinians since 2000, since the start of the Second Intifada. In response to all of this critique, in 2013, the Turkel Commission put out its report, which was a fascinating exercise because if you were someone who supported the Israeli military or within the Israeli military or government, that was hailed as a report that put a rubber stamp on Israel having a pretty decent military justice system, especially as compared to its peers, like the United States, Canada, Netherlands. And if you were a human rights lawyer or advocate, you saw it as an indictment of the system with 21 different recommendations, solid recommendations of ways in which the system needed to fundamentally change. And the only real change that has been made since then has been creating a fact-finding assessment mechanism, FFA, which is supposed to take accusations of violations of the laws of war out of the military advocate general and out of the chain of command, out of the units that were part of the operation, and do a quick turnaround to decide whether an investigation will be opened. It is supposed to solve the problems of independence, impartiality, promptness, transparency, and yet, many years later, if we take the May 2021 assault on Gaza as an example, of the hundreds of strikes carried out that killed civilians there, only 84 incidents were transferred over to this fact-finding assessment mechanism. And as of a year later, and I unfortunately don't have the data from more updated data, but as of a year later, 70% of them were still under review and only one had been investigated, had led to a criminal investigation. So what any criminal court is going to look for is whether Israel has a criminal justice system that is willing and able to properly investigate the crimes committed by its own soldiers and political officials in their involvement in these crimes. And what I see and what I think the evidence shows is a lack of both. There will, for certain, be claims of the opposite, and this is what will be the first hurdle before we can even get to a real adjudication of the facts. So I wanted to bring this to you in order to highlight it for you as we go forward. There is one crime that Israel commits that it has no argument or no claim to make that it properly investigates. And it's actually one of the most widespread and systematic and impactful crimes that Israel commits, and that is the settlement enterprise. Israel does not consider settlements illegal under international law, and it makes no pretenses that it has any kind of mechanism for investigating those who are involved in that war crime. So it may be that if we want to start somewhere in holding Israel accountable for atrocities, that's one place to start. All right, thank you. I will end there and move to questions.
Thank you very much, Emily. If you have questions, please come to the microphone there. I think it's very important to go back to past attacks by Israel to lay out the pattern, and because if people can claim that they don't know exactly what's happening here, then autopsies on past attacks can certainly be useful. I'm unclear on a couple of things, so I want to ask you one specific question, and then I want to ask a more general question. If it is shown that Israel is incapable fundamentally of holding itself accountable, does that then give more leverage to the possibility, and I'm very skeptical of this, of the International Criminal Court, in spite of the fact that Israel is not a signatory to the International Criminal Court, nor is the US, but the Provisional Government of Palestine is a signatory. Does that facilitate that possibility?
I'm sorry, can you clarify just for a second?
Does showing that Israel is incapable or unwilling to hold itself accountable help force the hand of the International Criminal Court to move?
It certainly would
or
be.
Or should it?
Yes. Great question. I mean, first of all, there have been reports issued by some of Israel's human rights organizations. There was a report by B'Tselem issued, I believe, in the early 2010s that was called The Fig Leaf. And it was exactly about Israel's lack of willingness and capability of investigating its own crimes, its own soldiers' crimes. That will be a prerequisite for any criminal prosecution. So if it is, and I know that the Office of the Prosecutor of the ICC is very aware of this particular hurdle and very aware that would be what Israel would push back on with all of its might, is to say that the court doesn't have any jurisdiction at all because of this complementarity principle. Having all the evidence out there would certainly, I think, potentially motivate such a prosecution to go forward. But it's not the only factor, of course.
I've been going through, my day job is with the Institute for Public Accuracy, and I go back to my old news releases. And in 2010, the ICC said we're not going to look into what happened in 2009 with cast lead. So there's a record of the ICC punting on taking action. So the strategy, and then the question becomes a strategic one: how to force the ICC to live up to its alleged mandate. One of those concrete suggestions that I have heard and that I understand is getting some country, and this is literally any country that's a signer to the Genocide Convention can do that, to go to the World Court and to get an emergency ruling from the World Court on genocide. Now, that's at the UN level. That's not prosecuting individuals. But then it gets to the Security Council, and then the US is put in the position of effectively vetoing action on a World Court opinion. A very embarrassing situation for the US to be in, and then that can open it up for the General Assembly to come in using Uniting for Peace. And the General Assembly attempting to assert itself in terms of world governance. It seems to me like that's a major avenue of what can be done here. And again, it can be done by any country. It can be done by Bolivia or Algeria or South Africa or Brazil. These are countries that have said, many of them, that this is genocide. I mean, I'm tempted to defend the US here. The US administration doesn't use the word genocide because it knows if it does, then it has to act. Now we're in a position where other countries are using the word genocide and they are not acting. So I think that it somewhat puts the onus on them, and it also, again, I should say, puts the onus on media outlets that are covering this as genocide. They should then, I'm talking about Al Jazeera, I'm talking about Democracy Now!, should frame this question to their viewers, to the countries that are sympathetic to the Palestinian people. You're calling it genocide. We're showing you that it's genocide. We've had analysts on calling it genocide. Why are you not taking the next legal step by invoking the Genocide Convention to all of these countries?
If I could observe,
Please.
you may recall when the International Court of Justice said that the United States was guilty violating international law by mining the Nicaraguan harbors.
Correct.
And we said, so what?
Yeah.
We didn't pay any attention. That is, the deterrent effect of that ICJ ruling was zero.
Yeah,
In
but
fact, it
you
made it
didn't
look
have
like
a
a paper
global,
tire.
you didn't have a global movement with protests around the world. I'm not saying that this is a silver bullet, that it's going to do it, but it's another lever, and I don't see any good reason not to push that lever.
No,
I just wanted to add that I heard either this morning or yesterday, the days are blurring together, that a coalition of Palestinian human rights organizations has called on both the state of Palestine and other third states to do exactly that, to go to the ICJ with the claim under the Genocide Convention.
I'm not familiar with it. This is different from the El Haq Center for Constitutional Rights domestic U.S. move?
Different, yes.
Different
yes.
from that. That's news
Yes.
to me. I'd be
Yeah.
delighted to see that.
Yeah.
Unless Sarah wants to chime in on all of this, I would think that you have thoughts. Please.
Yes, thank you. So I'm hearing from staffers from Congress that the justification for bombing of all this infrastructure is that Hamas tunnels underneath all these.
Please, a little slower.
I'm sorry. I'm hearing from staffers from Congress that the justification for bombing all this infrastructure is that Hamas tunnels are underneath all these buildings. I think it may be hard to justify all this bombardment, and I believe that's one reason that Israel wants to expel Gazans out of Gaza to prevent the investigation documentation of these war crimes. What remedy does the ICC or the people investigating these crimes have to document these crimes if Israel tries to prevent these investigations from happening? I mean, physical documentation, satellite images will help, but documentation from the ground will surely help. I think in Yugoslavia there was access to investigate their war crimes, so how do you prevent them from blocking this?
Who'd like to take that?
It's very difficult. That's what the Israelis did and they tried to investigate Shireen Achi's assassination. You can't invade their sovereignty. Unless you want to declare war on Israel, they have control. And that's why, for example, you think you're going to get Putin in the ICC and he's going to permit you to investigate, his complicity in war crimes. It's not going to happen. Doesn't mean that at least you can stand up for what's right, even if it doesn't accomplish anything. But the fact is, you still have national sovereignty that blocks the investigations most of the time that are needed to unearth the investigation. If you have a criminal case, you got to prove it beyond a reasonable doubt, which makes, say, international law very frustrating because it's more politics than law.
I mean, on certain matters, I don't think that there's prima facie evidence of war crimes, and so you really don't need Israeli cooperation, like settlements, for example. It's one of the very few black letter laws. I think the only question that legal experts are debating is whether or not it's a so-called ongoing crime, as opposed to a crime that happens on the day it's done, the day it's built. So I think there's a lot that can be accomplished. This is not unique. This is fairly common that people don't cooperate with the investigators who are trying to haul them to prison. So I think the ICC has really zero justification to not proceed on. We're not even talking about 1 year, but over a decade of crimes that they
So
are
what I guess I'm
looking
saying
at.
is, if they try to say that the Hamas tunnels are underneath all these buildings, how do you counter that? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I mean, I don't know what you believe the relevance of tunnels
Okay.
is.
Well, that's
But let me just be clear. The presence of tunnels are not per se illegal.
Okay.
A tunnel can be a military base. A tunnel we celebrate the tunnels in Sarajevo. I just went to the Sarajevo Tunnel Museum to celebrate the Sarajevo population and how military forces brought in military equipment to support besieged Sarajevo. And much of the Western world was cheering them on. So the existence of tunnels is nothing, nothing that constitutes a crime or a violation of international law. There is nothing that says that Hamas can't fight. In fact, many people argue that any occupied population has a right to resist. But, armed groups can take up weapons, for a variety of reasons. The only rule that we're concerned with, or that the ICC is concerned with, is how you fight, not whether or not you fight.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks.
Please,
Hello.
and please introduce yourself.
My name is Nusrat, and I'm an investigative researcher in technology, policy, and open source intelligence space. Thank you for the amazing speeches. I really enjoyed them, especially the calls to action at the end, Sarah and Bruce. I have a question. What is the responsibility of tech companies, especially social media companies, their trust and safety teams, when it comes to misinformation and disinformation regarding the situation, regarding biased content moderation? Instagram, for example, apologized for auto-translating the Arabic word Palestinian in people's bios on their accounts to word terrorist. How does international law apply to tech companies or social media companies or organizations who are at the center of a cross-tech industry-led content moderation in the times of war or war crimes?
I've written a fair amount on related subjects, but not in this context, so please, go ahead.
I think the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda convicted, I don't know whether it's radio, some of the media people that you've described for inciting the genocide of the Tutus by Hutu. So the media is not immune from prosecution simply because they're the media.
Please use the
If
mic
the
more,
language,
Bruce.
yeah, if the language amounts to incitement, as the Rwanda tribunal showed, yeah, they can be prosecuted and convicted, and that did happen in Rwanda. It's a matter of degree here. We don't want to go too broad. We understand often speech can be very impassioned, but it's important. Sometimes, maybe impassioned speech is right and we're wrong. We always have to think about that. So typically, free speech and the law draws the line between, exhortation and incitement, where you're actively encouraging someone to commit a crime of that sort. And if you reach that threshold, yeah, you can be prosecuted as a media company, whether it's social media or otherwise.
The more general question about the power of big tech, which is enormous right now, ultimately these are private platforms that allege that they are immune from the First Amendment. That's not true. The First Amendment, and there's court precedent on this, correct me if I don't know if you've done work on this, Bruce, or anybody else, if there's collusion or coercion with government forces, which there almost certainly is, and indeed the Twitter files show that there is with these institutions, that makes it a First Amendment violation. And furthermore, you had Musk, outright say out loud what most tech companies say quietly, freedom of speech but not freedom of reach. That also is a First Amendment violation. The First Amendment not only stipulates that someone has freedom of speech, and there's Supreme Court rulings on this, it is also the freedom to hear. That is, there were cases in the 1950s of Americans subscribing to foreign periodicals, and the post office attempted to block that. And the Supreme Court ruled, you can't do that. When someone has First Amendment protection, as a U.S. citizen does, they are free to receive information as well. So I think that the current rubric of private actors, big tech companies determining speech is on a very shaky legal foundation that I feel will ultimately crumble, but it has such power behind it that that may take longer than it should. That's
In fact, one of those cases is before the U.S. Supreme Court now. It relates to government involvement with the social media companies concerning speech relating to COVID, and whether they were coercing, threatening, you need to have this kind of moderation or not that moderation. The lower court said that there was at least some government coercion, but I say that's now in the United States Supreme Court.
That said, I've been honestly a little surprised that Twitter, for example, where I spent far too much time, has been as open as it has been during the current crisis. I mean, I still feel like I'm shadow banned, but I'm not as shadow banned as I would have expected under these circumstances.
Hi, everyone. My name is Hani Mahbouba. I just wanted to say I'm Iraqi, and I'm here as I have a bachelor's in political science, and I'm aspiring to be a human rights lawyer. My question is directed to Mr. Bruce Fein and Emily, if you can answer this question. So my question is, why is Zionism, which is a radical ideology, being universally accepted rather than condemned, such as the case with any form of radical Islam, such as jihadist or ideology? And then my second question is, why has it been associated with being anti-Semitic? And the question is because right now, at the course of, you spoke about why don't we condemn Congress. I've been actually going to Congress and advocating for a ceasefire for quite some time. It's been 2 weeks. More of my colleagues have been going for American Muslims for Palestine. And what Congress has been responding is that we cannot directly say ceasefire. We have to, accept the solution of a humanitarian pause. And even as constituents, when we, communicate how that is completely contradictory because a humanitarian pause will not really stop the nonsense and endless killings of innocent Palestinian children and women and men. And, we find, Rashida Tlaib, and Cori Bush, who have introduced a House Resolution 786, which introduces a ceasefire, which urges the president to, demand an immediate ceasefire. And why is it that so many other congressmen and representatives have been, hesitant to sign onto this rather simple request to this clearly, international war crime? So thank you so much.
Well, I can take the second question. I don't think I remember what the first question was about. So you can take.
I remember it.
Okay, so I'll hand that off. Okay, why? First of all, Congress is a craven institution. It's basically, it runs away from responsibilities. It doesn't want to vote on war. It doesn't want to vote on anything. It passes, urge a ceasefire. Well, Congress can do that. Cut off all the money and say, Mr. President, we can't have any relations with Israel until X, Y, Z happens. Everything is, the president should decide it, not Congress. Congress should be saying, we're going to impeach you for high crimes and misdemeanors of running a war and committing genocide, which is a violation of 1091 of the Federal U.S. Code, unless you immediately stop and utilize all of the military and economic muscle of the United States to get Israel to comply with the Genocide Convention.
Right.
So that's what they need to do. A ceasefire? I mean, that's like, trying to, solve a war with a BB gun or something. This is a staggering violation to the Constitution. And I've been up there, I write articles of impeachment up there all of the time. Presidents for the last 60 years commit impeachable offenses. Lies about the war power, Congress does nothing. So so you ask why Congress doesn't do that? My view is that AIPAC has huge amount of monies. It was brought out earlier, I think, that one of the reasons why they got 100,000 turnout yesterday was because they paid $250 a bounty for everyone who showed. AIPAC has a huge amount of money. They're very well organized, politically and otherwise. They created a huge reputation for themselves in 1976 when Chuck Percy wanted to oppose, I guess 1986, I believe. Chuck Percy, a senator from Illinois, wanted to oppose a sale of AWACS planes. I mean, he supported AWACS plane sale to Saudi Arabia, which Israel didn't want, right? And the AWACS planes got sold, and AIPAC went after and destroyed Chuck Percy. And There's herd instinct up in Congress. Everyone felt after that, hey, we can't do anything. That's why it's amazing. You get an AIPAC supportive letter, it's 100 names on it. Netanyahu was once quoted as saying, I never want to be a state of the United States because I'll lose 100 votes in the Senate, which is probably true. So that's where we are politically, just as a matter of fact. And that's why Congress, unless people throw them out of office, will continue to basically act as a handmaiden of Israel and AIPAC.
All right.
Your first question is, if I remember correctly, is about why Zionism has been so broadly accepted and embraced,
Yes.
as opposed to being rejected like other radical or fanatic movements. And I am not a historian, and this isn't a legal question per se, but I will give you my perspective on it, mainly as someone who is quite familiar with the history and with Israeli society. What we can say is that Zionism took hold during a period when colonialism and settler colonialism were in fashion, and I think the shameful or even a source of paranoia and fear for a lot of Israelis and Jews around the world is that, in fact, the support for Jews returning to their homeland, as you know, as it was construed, was out of anti-Semitism, was out of the desire to push Jews out of their own countries.
Right.
And this only exacerbates Israeli xenophobia and fear and paranoia and tribalism and the insular feeling. So that is what I can share about where the movement came from and its potential connection to anti-Semitism, which I think you also raised.
Yeah, thank you. That did answer the question. I really wanted to, thank you for your clarification about why Congress really can't do much about it, and AIPAC's continued, influence in the United States democracy. My other question is, piggyback on that, is that what do you want us to do as American citizens and voters?
I would like you to write letters. I'd like to organize teach-ins like we did in the Vietnam War, and advocate.
We've been doing that.
And just continue it and continue to use your resources. And it can't be just one time. You got to go
Right.
back again and again and again. If you're in town, you can visit members' offices. They have district offices, your local district there. Try to talk your local newspaper.
Right.
Meet with the board of editors there so that they'll start to write about it so there's real accountability. I mean, I had a member of Congress say, Bruce, talking to my constituents in the newspapers about the Constitution is like reading Shakespeare to cows. That needs to change, right? You need to, and you have to be persistent about this because there's all sorts of other distractions that they have.
No, absolutely.
So that's what a citizen does. Now, it may look like it's not very much at the outset, but I go back to William Lloyd Garrison and saying the Constitution was a covenant with hell because it endorsed slavery. He was one person at the time. So if it's only one person, fine. That's the best you can do.
I appreciate you saying that. Thank you.
Phil, we have less than 10 minutes, so let's try to, I don't know how many questioners we have, but let's try to get as many as possible.
Okay.
As short as you can, please.
My name is Mohammed Shinal from the Voice of America. Israel argues that Gaza is no longer an occupied land. So does the political context, including resistance to an occupying force and the imbalances of power, affect the analysis under the international humanitarian law?
Yeah, I think Israel's opinion of what is and isn't occupied land is really of zero relevance to the legal determination. Gaza is recognized as part of the occupied Palestinian territory, one single territory that is divided into 4 segments. And the Red Cross has explained why it continues to recognize Gaza as occupied territory despite the withdrawal of Israeli troops in 2006. Every major human rights organization that writes on Israel-Palestine continues to recognize that Gaza is occupied because of Israel's control of the territory. And I think you'll see more and more remote control of occupied territories going forward with the advances in autonomous weapons and surveillance and so forth. So I think they're just at the forefront of that. But in any event, it's pretty moot now because Israeli troops are back on the ground in Gaza and have declared their intent to remain as occupiers there physically as well as effectively.
So when I asked at the State Department, I'm sorry, Bruce, did you want to chime in?
No.
So when I asked at the State Department, do you recognize the Fourth Geneva Convention, and they won't give me a straight answer. The implication of that is that they don't, and that therefore they don't view Palestinians in Gaza as, I think, effectively pretending that international, the U.S. says we want Israel, we expect and we want Israel to abide by international law, but we don't specify what that international law is. Can you break that down? I mean, if the U.S. is saying effectively, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the Fourth Geneva Convention doesn't apply, then I realize that any objective observer would say that it does apply, but what's the import of the U.S. saying that? Or seeming to have that posture?
It just shows a complete hypocrisy. It's the same thing as saying, we have your full back, do whatever you want unconditionally, but actually we want you to comply with the rules of law. So it's just politics, and they shouldn't be taken seriously.
Sam, I think you backed them into a corner because...
I want to back them more into a corner.
Full support. You backed them into a corner, and that's why they didn't want to talk about the applicability of the Geneva Conventions to Gaza. I don't think it's because the U.S. actually doesn't believe in the Geneva Conventions in principle, and the State Department reports that evaluate human rights also reflect on, I believe, the relevance of the Geneva Conventions. U.S. administrations recognize Palestinian territories as occupied, so on and so forth. I think the crux of the matter is that they think they can dodge and punt the application of international law in Palestine vis-a-vis Israel, but then still uphold international law and the Geneva Conventions in, say, Ukraine. And I think one of our important jobs to make home is it's not a cafeteria. You don't get to pick and choose when it applies. And if you denigrate and harm the Geneva Conventions by questioning its applicability and relevance, just as you permit Israel to target journalists, that's going to spread, and you are effectively destroying international law. So we need to do a better job of bringing the consequences home of that approach of punting and dodging and leaving to broader interests of the United States that wants to see international law upheld. I don't actually agree that their goal is to dismantle international law. Rather, they think they can get away by picking and choosing.
Right. The rules-based order is we pick which law applies in which time. Go ahead.
What I find really interesting is that it mirrors essentially the Israeli official position on the Fourth Geneva Convention. So,
correct.
First of all, civilians will be protected persons whether there's an occupation or not as soon as there's an international armed conflict, which there is, and I don't believe that's in dispute. But the question of whether occupation law specifically applies, Israel has always said that it does not believe that the Fourth Geneva Conventions are customary international law and only applies Hague law, so the Hague Conventions of 1907, and in particular takes objection to the 1977 additional protocols, which are quite key because they have a lot to say about the principle of distinction and indiscriminatory attacks on civilians, and also make settlement, the transfer of the population from the occupying power into the territory it occupies, a grave breach of the Geneva Conventions. So what it sounds to me is like there's been a lot of that kind of legal analysis of rejecting the idea that that is customary international law, which is a minority opinion in the international community. The vast majority would say that it is customary, and it applies whether Israel believes that it does or not. It seems like that position is being fed to those in the American government that you're speaking with.
I think you can summarize it going back to Thucydides. It's just another variation of the strong do what they can, and the weak suffer what they must. Legal analysis, I often debate John Yoo over at the National Defense University. He says, Bruce, my client is never wrong. I said, really? Your client's supposed to be the Constitution. No, it's the President of the United States. Anyway, that's the attitude that they have there. That's why you have, the legal analysis, and apparently from the news reports, they got 500 internal dissents for the State Department complaining about what's going on here.
There is dissent within.
Yeah,
So what the U.S. position is becomes a question as to what you mean by the U.S.
Yeah, it means that the people who have authority to announce what the position is figure if we got the strength, we'll just say whatever it is. International law means whatever we want it to mean. Unfortunately, that's what big powers do.
I don't know if okay. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to the National Interest Foundation. Thank you, Emily, Bruce, and Sarah Lee. Thank you all for being here.
Can I have your first, please?